Alli is Director of Community Partnerships at AI Now Institute. The reason that I have invited Alli to speak to us today is AI Now Institute. Alli and their comrades' work is has resulted in one of the coolest things that I have seen when it comes to those of us dealing with data centers these days. It is the appropriately named North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit. So with that, I will stop talking and let y'all hear from Alli.
So welcome. We have the next hour to talk about how policy can serve as an organizing tool in our data center fights. The goals of this are to help clarify what we are fighting for and identify tangible, bright line policy solutions to stop and curtail data center expansion at the local and state level. The policy toolkit that this workshop is based on, also now includes federal recommendations. We're not going to go into that for today, but they are there. Our goal with this is to increase our shared understanding of the range of different ways that data centers can be regulated, from zoning to water to electricity. There's a lot of tools out there, and they're not always obvious. Just a quick self-intro so you know who's talking to you today. As Kyle said, I work as Director of Community Partnerships with the AI Now Institute, which I'll introduce more expansively in just a moment. I also help coordinate the Data Center Working Group, which is a nationwide coalition of local, state, and then some national groups resisting data center expansion. And that, that working group, that coalition space is the origin story of this policy work. We're trying to fill gaps in what people need on the ground. So just briefly about AI Now, we are a fully independent policy research institute founded in 2017. We challenge and reimagine the current trajectory of AI, pushing the industry away from commercial surveillance, the consolidation of power in big tech, and lack of accountability. So what we try to do is connect what's going on in the AI industry, in the market, and the policy space to the downstream harms on everyday people, including, I imagine, many of the folks that you work with every day, and aim to kind of translate that and equip organizers, community members, advocates, and policymakers with tools to fight back. And as I said, we do this in coalition with folks on the ground across the country. Also, I'm not looking at the chat very closely, so if there's any questions that come up, I'll ask the RPC folks, feel free to flag them for me. Okay, just a quick agenda for today, and you are welcome to laugh at my meme if you were so inclined. I'm going to briefly ground us in what we are up against in this moment. I'm going to talk about some things to consider in policymaking about data centers. It is not a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately. I'm going to give you an overview of our local and state policy recommendations, and then we're actually going to do a quick vote and dive into maybe one or two issue areas in more detail. This is a partial list. There's a few others, including taxation and air quality, that we could get into in more depth. But again, everything that I'm sharing is also available in our toolkit. And I just want to say also, policy is not a be-all, end-all. I came to this work as an organizer, as an advocate. I firmly believe that people power is the core of our work. So I really view policy as a tool, an extension in our data center organizing, especially because so much of the decision-making about data centers is embedded in our local administrative processes and democratic processes like permitting, zoning, and data center developers and backers know this and use this. So really part of this policy work is figuring out how to navigate the processes of our own institutions and shift power back to where it should be held. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what we are up against in this moment. Data center construction, particularly hyperscalers or these really, really big monstrous facilities, has doubled in the past 3 or 4 years, and that is not by accident. To understand the data center build out, we need to understand the trajectory and the current moment of the AI industry. And I also find it helpful to approach this policy work with a power analysis. So I'm just going to go through a couple of ground truths that we see in this moment so we know how to navigate it. How we talk about AI is intimately linked to how we win data center fights. And it can be really easy to get sucked into debates of, is ChatGPT good or not? Should we use it individually or not? But the real question here is the AI industry's consolidation of power good for society? Is this trajectory that we want for the future? And there's this, the very intentional industry created narrative of inevitability, which, as we'll talk about today, is false, that we're just on this train and it's going and we can't push back. And that's categorically untrue. And the trajectory that we're in today is the result of a number of very distinct choices made by those in power in the industry. So I'm going to go through these really quick so we can get to the policy pieces. The first truth that we need to understand about big tech and big AI is that AI, as we're talking about it, is a hyper consolidation of power. And I like to start with a little bit of history of how we got to this moment. There's a famous moment in kind of the historical studies of AI called the AlexNet paper in 2012. This is when three researchers created an algorithm showing that supervised machine learning trained on very large amounts of labeled data could be really good at predictive pattern recognition. And the key here was not the algorithm itself. This wasn't a technological marvel. This algorithm was decades old. But what they did was they paired the algorithm with extremely large amounts, not just of data, but of computing power. So NVIDIA's chips in this case. And this moment, almost 15 years ago now, created a paradigm of scale that has come to define today's trajectory of AI development for all of the big tech and the big industry players. And this logic says that in order to have the most advanced models, you have to have the extraordinary amounts of data and compute. And even in 2012, these resources were already being concentrated in the hands of big tech firms, and that's even truer today. So what that means is the players who are poised to win this AI race are those who can concentrate their compute resources in-house, create and capitalize on data monopolies, and monetize this investment as quickly as possible. Controlling cloud and core infrastructure, meaning data centers, is a key part of this. It's a key part of this trajectory that these tech companies are pursuing to maintain dominance. So at AI Now, we routinely say there's no AI without big tech, and this is precisely why. And I know many times I've heard people try to pitch data centers to me saying, oh, well, they're for progress, they're for the benefit of people in this town. But unfortunately, that doesn't match what's happening in history and in the present. Second ground truth here is that the current AI market is incredibly precarious. And I think that's really important to understand as a grounding for our policy work, because when policymakers bring in data centers, they are essentially investing local resources, local budgets, and our local grid into a shaky market. So big tech firms are currently spending a truly shameful amount of capital on AI infrastructure. To be really brief about it, these firms are looking at an $800 billion shortfall. Despite all of their promises to cure cancer and solve climate change, they have yet to find a sustainable business model. They're burning a lot of money, investing in one another in these circular financing structures, and now turning to their only tried and tested revenue stream, which is monetizing through ads. And this extraordinary gamble all but requires government support. So there's lots of talk of a bailout, potential bailout. What do we think of that? The truth is that this government bailout is already underway and has been for some time. So we see this kind of in a four-part process. AI firms are turning to the government to secure lucrative contracts, and push an industrial policy strategy that sees the government, de-risking, investing in de-risking and deregulation, and then direct investment to shore up this otherwise very shaky business model. So we see kind of this build at all costs really playing out in the data center space, including on federal lands, tribal lands, so that US tech companies can sell their product to the government and abroad. And the last truth that I just want to ground us in here is that this market power in the industry breeds political power and vice versa. So big tech firms and these other powerful players, by that I mean data center developers, private equity, real estate, they've used their size and power advantage to really manipulate our democratic processes. That includes everything from, the foundational approval and zoning processes to larger regulatory processes and public utility commissions. Private equity is pushing to take over public utilities in multiple geographies. And we see the steamrolling of, environmental laws. These are just a few. Again, nothing about this trajectory is inevitable. I know that can kind of sound like doom and gloom, but what I'm trying to do actually is demystify a little bit of what's going on. So we can see that this is essentially a business strategy that doesn't benefit people and that we can push back against. And I'm going to come back to these pictures, which are of communities, most of which I know personally, pushing back against data centers across the country in urban, suburban, and rural environments. I just want to pause there to see if there's any kind of quick questions on the industry or anything behind this build out before we talk policy. Okay, so North Star Policy Toolkit. What is this toolkit all about? This is primarily geared to policy interventions that will help us stop, slow, and restrict rampant data center development in the US at the local and state level, and now we've added federal as well. These are intentionally North Star interventions, so the strongest possible policy interventions we could find or create, plus scaffolded steps to get there for when that is not feasible. We live in the real world and know that we're fighting in incredibly difficult political environments. So it's not only here's the pie in the sky, but what we can use to get there in smaller steps. And the policy toolkit emerged from a need we were hearing from organizers and policymakers across the country, where kind of in these moments of opportunity in local fights, we realized that we didn't know what to ask for, and people didn't know what to ask for because there's so many different types of expertise that go into regulating data centers. It's very rare to have all of them, and also the policy recommendations out there often either were narrow in scope or more holistic, but perhaps a little bit more incrementalist. So I just want to note, we developed this toolkit initially in the fall in consultation with over 50 community organizers, state advocates, technical experts, and policymaker networks. A partial list of contributors are included here. Special shout out to the Data Center Working Group and participants in Memphis at an organizer training hosted by Memphis Community Against Pollution and Media Justice. And we also consulted a very long list of existing ordinances and recommendations from community-based groups and technical experts. And the toolkit includes examples throughout to try to point to as many kind of real-world applications as possible. So you can think of the toolkit like a menu of options that also lists the detailed ingredients for each entree. At a really high level view, you'll see a comprehensive list of different interventions across a range of issues that might be relevant to your community. And when you click into each recommendation, you'll see highly specific examples and language that you can include in ordinance and demands. But not everything is going to work everywhere, so it's really up to you to take the parts that work for you and leave the rest. Second point, besides the menu of options, that this is a strategic document. It is framed on the belief that we, the public, should decide whether or not a data center works in the interest of our communities. So we can understand some of the issue-specific recommendations around water, energy, air quality, both to substantively limit the impact of data centers and to act as mechanisms to restrict or slow down or throw friction in data center development when they don't work to the community's best interest. Throughout the guide, we have examples of existing and proposed policies, and we have categorized them as very strong, weak, or cautionary, noting that it's just as helpful to see examples that don't go far enough. But inclusion of an example doesn't mean we endorse the specific language used in each case. And where there's not strong examples, we've consulted a range of experts and on-the-ground experts to identify what that action should be. I'm also going to go into key considerations in a moment, so I won't mention that here. Last thing I'll say about the guide itself, we are going to be relaunching it next week as an interactive website. Right now it's a PDF. That's what Kyle dropped in. It's going to be a lot easier to use starting next Tuesday. So you can sort by local, state, or federal. You can sort by issue area. You can search. There are guides, so you don't have to read a 90-page document. Okay. I'm going to go through a few things of what to consider in policymaking, and these are really your tools to then figure out which of the policy interventions to use or that might apply in your jurisdiction. And if some of this already feels familiar, please feel free to use it in your own trainings, internal, external education, and how you talk about this. So the first is, of course, beware of preemption and hierarchy of authority in law. Federal law, supersedes state law, which supersedes local. So for each issue area in your state, you need to be aware of what your local jurisdiction has the ability to do. For example, some jurisdictions might have the legal authority to explicitly ban data centers, but in other states, there are laws preempting that. So those localities don't have that option. They might be able to restrict certain types of development or go to other issue area interventions. And also here, right, is not every intervention is best suited for each level of government. So we can think about state law in terms of data centers as, holistic regulation, right? Economic development, statewide transparency policies, cross-state energy capacity, whereas local is really about thinking of regulating specific data centers, specific facilities, and all parts of the kind of development timeline of a data center, from proposal to construction to expansion, operation, and then resource use. And I just want to make a note here also on the preemption point. I get a lot of questions about the administration's efforts at preemption. There was the AI executive order earlier this year. There was just a national policy framework that the White House released. I'm happy to go into this in more detail in questions, but what I'll say here is that congressional preemption is what we need to be concerned about. These executive proclamations and orders do not yet preempt states and localities from regulating AI, including data centers. And that's why it's also important to categorically oppose federal and congressional preemption, but we're not there yet. Other things to consider in policymaking, is assessing where our community is. Where are we in the process? If a data center hasn't come to town yet, great. Now is the time to put in the strongest protections possible. Same thing if a data center has been proposed but not approved, but you might need to use more of your organizing energy to turn people out to those meetings, right? And I also just want to make sure it's clear that even if you already live in a jurisdiction with the ongoing data center build out, you still can pursue these policies and apply them to both current and future development. Also, it's important to understand what laws or processes your local jurisdiction has. They probably won't mention data centers, but they might mention large-scale industrial users, large quantity water users, things like that. So it's important to know what is already there to see if you can amend it versus needing new regulation or legislation. Oops, I'll go back. And then another thing to remember here, right, is that the corporations building and operating data centers often lie. There are we're seeing, I would say, increasing co-optation of our policy recommendations by corporations when it's convenient for them, and also to address this rising tide of public opinion in opposition of the data center build out. For example, these kind of voluntary tech company commitments to pay for their own energy use, or to reject certain tax breaks, right? Microsoft can do that because they've already locked in their deals and received hundreds of millions in tax breaks. Same note of caution for community benefits. I know there's many different perspectives around this, but my word of caution is that we're seeing corporations increasingly push this strategy because they know it means that they can get the most favorable terms and really isolate communities from one another, and negotiate on a project-to-project level. They have the resources to do that. We don't. And lastly, the policy recommendations here, they each can't exist in isolation. We need to think holistically about how corporate power has really manipulated our entire democratic process, like with the private equity takeover, and also consider policy recs that address this. And last thing to consider here, and I'll mention it up front so I don't have to mention it each time, is that enforcement power is really key. Right now, many of the existing ordinances addressing data centers include, at best, really nominal fines for violations of law or policy, $1,000 a day, for example. That's a lot for me, but that's not a lot for a billionaire tech company, right? So we need actual consequences that are in line with the scale of the richest companies in the world. And that doesn't just include fines, but the ability for localities to reject applications, the ability to stop deployment after approval or withdraw resource access, such as water or energy, at any time. And what is needed beneath enforcement to make it possible is transparency requirements, right? Proactive, independent evaluation before any project, and then ongoing monitoring throughout. I'm going to go through now an overview of the local and state recommendations at a really high level, and then we will get more specific. So this is a summary of the interventions targeted at local governments. Our toolkit begins with ways that local governments can explicitly prohibit or restrict data centers, enact temporary pauses known as moratoriums, or set up approval processes that allow them to reject data centers that do not fit within a locality's goals. Some of those goals can be existing climate or environmental standards, for example, or governance around resource use. I want to highlight here that we go through the detailed processes of establishing conditional use permits. This is one of the most useful tools a local government can put in place. Right now, many data centers can be automatically approved under existing zoning laws. You might hear about by right approvals. And conditional use permitting is a tool that means a data center cannot be approved unless it abides by certain conditions. And it's up to you all and local governments to decide what those conditions could be. If none of those things are possible where you live, we can also, or in addition, we can also go to zoning ordinances and municipal code amendments. So there's lots of different tools within zoning, including siting and setback laws, adjustments to the zoning process that give you a lot of different entry points. Noise mitigation measures, water resources, energy resources. I'm just skimming over these now because we'll likely get into some of them. You have some ability at the local level to limit tax incentives and subsidies, although this is really largely at the state level. And then I also want to call out air pollution and community health measures, because we know, firsthand that many data centers are installing backup diesel generators on site. This has been a huge issue in places such as Memphis, and I imagine many of your communities, and we can prohibit or limit the use of diesel generators here. I'll note also that there are recommendations around local fair labor requirements. This is typically not where we recommend starting because data centers employ so few people. But if you have momentum there, or you're putting in together kind of a more holistic package of recommendations, we have consulted with labor organizers and former data center workers to fill those out as well. Okay, I'm going to briefly go over state recommendations. Okay, and I see this question on state level recommendations, so let me talk through, and then Philip, I'll get to your question. This is an overview of state and regional recommendations. These are primarily targeted interventions at the state level, but in some cases, they might instead span multiple counties or several states, such as the recommendations regulating public utility commissions. And here we go over statewide moratoriums, oversight and transparency mechanisms, and repealing or limiting subsidies. These are kind of three of the strongest interventions possible at the state level. And I don't just mean strongest, I mean most feasible. These are roughly in the order of kind of most appropriate for the state level to slightly less appropriate. So for example, going back to local policy, there are recommendations here for limiting tax incentives at the local level, but this is really much more doable at the state level since that's where we see a lot more tax breaks. Tax breaks are really critical since many states, partially or fully exempt data centers from paying taxes, and this has direct repercussions on the budgets for schools and local infrastructure projects. I always like to call out Good Jobs First as the experts on subsidies and tax policy, and we work very closely with them, and I'm happy to make any connections if people have questions about subsidies in their locality or state. Our guide also spends a significant amount of time on energy regulations at the state level, including how states can establish strong ratepayer protections, promote grid stability, and accelerate renewable energy infrastructure. And then again, like I mentioned before, we also go into how to limit corporate influence over processes involved in data center development, like public utilities processes and elections. And again, then some things you can do with labor, it is a bit more limited. And at the state level, I would say it is quite technically possible, although sometimes politically difficult, to pass regulations protecting constituents from the deployment of certain AI technologies. So just to recap, our zoning recommendation, if you can't or don't want to, fully ban data centers or ban data centers over a student size or resource use, is to site them in specific industrially zoned areas, with a caveat that in many places, industrial zones tend to be located next to communities that are Blacker, browner, typically lower income, more poor and working class, and have faced kind of legacies of environmental racism or corporate extractivism, and often, in some cases, like in Memphis, already facing decades of increased pollution causing increased cancer and asthma rates and things like that. So yes, that can be a way to mitigate harm, and also it's really based on your environment, your communities, if that is going to push the build off to communities that might have fewer resources to then deal with it. It's very tricky. Okay, I'm gonna share my slide again. Can folks see zoning? Can I get a thumbs up? Great, thank you. Okay, so zoning, like I said, almost all local. There is a lot here, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. I'm going to start here, right, with kind of the most straightforward one is full-on prohibitions or restrictions of data center development. Localities can issue ordinances that fully ban construction of new data centers, prohibit expansion of existing data centers, or perhaps, in the case of Atlanta and Groton, Connecticut, limit certain types of build out. So Atlanta banned data centers in the Beltline overlay district. Groton, Connecticut, actually after passing a year-long moratorium, then banned data centers larger than 12,500 square feet. Local moratoriums are, time-bound prohibitions, temporary pauses on new data center approvals that could then lead to a ban or give you time to put in place perhaps stronger protections, including revised zoning requirements. And we recommend a minimum of at least 180 days, although the stronger the better. I also want to highlight that, moratoriums, like I really talk about them as a common sense solution. They're also only good as what you do when they're in place. And we have a number of precedents of localities as well as even utilities such as AEP Ohio using moratoriums to figure out this build out. Statewide and regional moratoriums are also a possibility. Regional, again, looking at the utility. There's a number of statewide proposals currently on the table, but no actual statewide moratorium in place. Yes, exactly, Birmingham. We're seeing an increased use of these. If you can't ban data centers outright, you still have a lot of tools at your disposal. So you can build mechanisms into approval and zoning processes to reject data centers that don't meet the locality's goals or standards. And these can be a huge range, right? Whatever either you already have or want to institute. Water and energy use, heat mitigation, economic development standards, environmental standards. Phoenix, for example, has clean air goals, although again, the data center build out in Phoenix is quite expansive. And there's a number of different kind of ways to do this. You have a lot of different approaches for mechanisms. They can be establishing county or city goals, town goals, requiring independent review by experts with decision-making authority. And I encourage anyone looking at studies or independent assessments to require the data center developer to fund them, but not to run them. Burden shifting to the developer, and then again, enforcement power. Conditional use permitting, I briefly mentioned this before. I just want to go into it with a bit more detail. So conditional use permit processes for data centers, typically within local or county zoning code, set a distinct class for data centers that then allows you to avoid by right zoning, which is what is currently in place in many areas. Our recommendation here in your zoning code is to define data centers quite expansively. Some jurisdictions are defining data centers explicitly, right? Explicitly, but expansively. Others use phrases like large industrial users. This is really going to depend on your local context, on your state and local laws. There are concerns that in some places, not all, if you define data centers specifically, data center developers will sue and charge you with discrimination. That's again based on state law. So just encourage you to consult with folks in your locality and in your state about that. A conditional use permit processes for data centers means that there is no permit unless it is approved. It is assumed rejected until approved. And you can attach binding conditions to that approval process. And then with this also, we recommend both pre and post-approval transparency mechanisms. So mandating public notice of any proposal at least 90 days in advance, and including that documentation, making it public online, requiring community hearings, rejecting proposals without adequate transparency, banning NDAs in the process, and the list goes on. So for example, now after the Project Blue fight, which is still ongoing, Tucson, Arizona requires, all documents related to data center projects be public 90 days before any public meeting. We do have some strong examples of this. I will say here, there is a lot more in terms of zoning, kind of different aspects of zoning, setback requirements, siting, etc. I can get more into this in questions, but I'm going to move forward to energy just for the sake of time. So we have a few moments for questions at the end, just skipping water, but you can see that it's there. Okay, so looking at energy, the bulk of our regulations here are focused on protecting ratepayers from subsidizing the cost of data centers, mitigating the financial risk, and promoting grid stability, and these are done at the state level. But first, what is possible at the local level? I think that's also important to understand. Again, local governments can pass some ordinances limiting the harmful effects of this energy rollout while rejecting proposals that do not work in the community's best interest. So localities can, for example, mandate that any data center project use what would be a gold standard of 24/7 zero emissions, additional or additive renewable energy to be approved. That would be, again, in the approval and the zoning process, even though it's about energy. And it's really important to designate that this is additional or additive renewables to ensure that data centers don't take energy away from another project that would have used available renewable energy to decarbonize. The second point here, and I know that there's different approaches to this, but our recommendation is to prohibit off-grid and behind-the-meter power generation, particularly in prohibiting backup diesel generators. We are seeing across the board data centers, searching for behind-the-meter solutions because our energy grids, our electricity grids just don't have enough capacity to produce all this power for data center demand. This often is gas generation and then kind of these speculative, untested versions of nuclear power. And, this also allows data centers and the companies to sidestep investments into publicly, into energy infrastructure that serves the public as well. So just a note of caution there, while the companies make a big deal about solar and renewables, that is not at all the majority of those off-grid or behind-the-meter generation investments currently. In approval processes, localities can also require capacity commitments and will serve letters from utilities with enforcement power. They can tax all electricity use with no exemptions if there is not state preemption, and put in tools like increasing the tax action rate during energy emergencies such as heat waves. And then again, in approval processes, retaining the right to curb or shut off energy during emergencies. And we've seen calls for this come from bipartisan coalitions, including state legislators in the PJM area. At the state level, we can call for strong ratepayer protections to protect everyday people from subsidizing the cost of data centers and associated energy infrastructure. So that means requiring data centers to pay separately for 100% of the costs needed to service them, instituting an equitable tariff schedule, potentially investigating or revising cost allocation methodologies, and then allocating any additional fees to data centers where applicable, including for studies. We have some positive examples of tariff schedules being revised, including in Oregon, to try to even out some of those imbalances. And a tariff schedule, for those who aren't familiar, which is completely normal, is kind of the official pricing structure set by utility companies. It includes rates per unit of energy and other charges, such as service fees, and large load customers need to be subject to a tariff schedule. Our position is that these large load customers must be subject to a tariff schedule that's equal or proportional to the cost of serving them. Yes, big shout out to those in Virginia. Again, a note of caution here. I think this is an area where, the tech industry, the data center industry is starting to echo our demands. That's a testament to the organizing of every single person on this call and across the country. And most of the commitments, which are still voluntary, don't go far enough. And even if every data center company and tech company were to pay for the costs of all the energy, it doesn't address the rest of the harm of this build out. So congrats for the progress that we have made there, but just to note that that's not the only piece. There's some other things we can do here in terms of protecting ratepayers. We recommend to look at the option of creating separate rate classes for large load customers, and we define those at 20 megawatts or more. That's to answer the question before via your Public Utility Commission. And there's also things that can be done in the contracting process, such as minimum contract lengths, minimum demand upfront payments, and an upfront security deposit, basically protecting both ratepayers and then the region if this is a bubble and it pops and these become stranded assets. If there's no contract protections, then folks, and local government, everyday people are left paying the bill instead of these companies. My last point here, and then I'll open it up for final questions, is there's also a set of recommendations we have in terms of energy around grid stability and accelerating renewable energy infrastructure. So that includes, safeguards to mitigate inconsistent monthly energy usage, retaining the right to curb or shut down energy during emergencies and peak demand, just like at the local level, instituting electricity caps. For example, Maine caps the share of in-state electricity sales from power provided to data centers at 25%. I won't comment if that's the right percentage as possible, but again, we do have precedent. And requiring data centers to follow energy efficient standards. And then, of course, investing in additional renewables. I am going to really quickly just leave you all with some resources, and then I'll answer any final questions. Again, I will pass the slides along to Kyle and Aaron, so you'll have access to all of the issue areas, not only energy and zoning. And then all of these links, you have access to our North Star Policy Toolkit. We recently released as the Data Center Working Group a site fight guide that's really kind of an organizing and strategy 101 for those engaged in local site fights, particularly those new to the fight. There's an interest form for the Data Center Working Group. And then highlighting, we have a few upcoming trainings. We're going to be doing a deep dive training series into the main policy areas of the toolkit starting April 22nd. It will be weekly. And the Data Center Working Group is doing a series of organizing trainings with the Addition project starting late April. And I'll drop in my contact info as well.